The ink under Jane Sterling's fingernails was the only jewelry she could afford, and perhaps the only kind she truly respected. It was a faint, violet-black stain that lingered in the delicate creases of her skin, a mark of her constant commerce with the written word and the cold, hard logic of numbers. To the household at Ravenscroft Hall, she was merely the governess, a silent, grey-clad fixture who moved through the drafty corridors with the inconspicuous grace of a shadow. She was a woman of 25 who had learned the value of being invisible. In invisibility, there was the freedom to observe. In observation, there was the power to survive. Jane wore the same charcoal grey bombazine dress every day for 3 years. The fabric was worn thin at the elbows but kept meticulously clean, the scent of lavender and starch clinging to the fibers despite the dampness of the northern air. She was a master of the private art of survival, a woman who had been cast out of her own social circle by a father's gambling and a family name dragged through the mud. She had found sanctuary in the very labor the peerage despised. In the schoolroom of Ravenscroft Hall, the air was perpetually cool. It tasted of old parchment, and the sharp, medicinal scent of beeswax used to polish the mahogany desks. Jane sat at the head of the long table, her spine a rigid, uncompromising line that refused to yield to the fatigue of a 10-hour workday. Across from her sat Master Oliver Ravenscroft, the Duke's ward and a boy who seemed to have been constructed entirely of jagged edges and inherited resentment. He was 10 years old, with the restless energy of a caged bird and a habit of testing the boundaries of every authority figure he encountered. Today, he was attempting to dismantle the structure of his classical translations with a deliberate, sullen incompetence. He stared at the page as if the letters were enemies rather than tools. Jane did not flinch when he dropped his quill, leaving a jagged blot of ink across the expensive vellum. She did not sigh when he claimed the words of the ancient poets were nonsense designed to torture children. She did not plead for his attention or offer the hollow bribes of a desperate teacher. Instead, she sat in a silence so profound it seemed to pull the very air from the room. Her eyes were fixed on the ticking of the long-case clock in the corner. To her, the clock was not merely a timekeeper. It was a rhythmic reminder of the order that governed the universe. She measured her life by the ticking of the clock. Each second was a small, hard-earned victory of discipline over the chaos that had once ruined her family. She watched the dust motes dance in a single shaft of late-afternoon light, counting them mentally to maintain her composure. Oliver looked at her, his jaw set in a line that mimicked the stubbornness of the Ravenscroft line. He expected a lecture. He expected a sharp rap on the knuckles or the weary disappointment he received from his guardian. He found neither. Jane Sterling simply waited. She waited for him to realize that his rebellion had no audience. She waited for him to understand that in this room, logic was the only currency accepted. When the silence had stretched to the point of discomfort, she spoke in a voice that was level, low, and entirely devoid of heat. It was the voice of a woman who had audited her own soul and found the balance correct. She did not demand that he pick up the pen. She did not insist upon his respect. She simply pointed to the blot on the page and remarked that a man who could not manage his tools could never hope to manage his inheritance. The boy's eyes widened. A flicker of genuine curiosity broke through his practiced boredom. It was a technical observation, a matter of stewardship rather than morality, and it struck a chord in him that no amount of scolding ever could. He picked up the quill. The schoolroom was not a place of education. It was a fortress of order in a crumbling world, and Jane was its silent architect. She watched him work, her mind already moving toward the ledger hidden in her desk, the one that recorded more than just conjugation errors. Arthur Ravenscroft, the Duke, stood in the deep shadows of the library doorway. His winter-grey eyes were narrowed as he watched the scene through a narrow gap. He was a man who felt the decay of his duchy in his very bones. The stone of the hall was cold because he could not afford the coal to heat every room. The silver on the sideboard was dull because the staff had been halved. His own heart was a landscape of frozen duty and looming insolvency. He had expected to find his ward in a state of riotous disobedience, as was the boy's custom. Instead, he saw a woman who seemed to command the room with nothing more than her own unwavering presence. He watched the way Jane Sterling moved. It was a study in economy and precision. When she reached for a book, her fingers did not fumble. When she corrected a line of text, her movements were surgical. She treated the messy, emotional outbursts of a 10-year-old as if they were errors in a ledger. They were distractions to be noted, accounted for, and then systematically corrected. Arthur felt a strange, jarring sense of recognition. He was a man drowning in a sea of unmanaged debts and failing harvests. Here was a woman who had mastered the art of holding back the tide with a single, ink-stained hand. He noticed the fraying at her cuffs and the way she held her breath when she reached for a heavy volume, a silent admission of the physical toll her labor took. The Duke stepped into the room. The floorboards groaned under his weight, a sound that usually signaled the end of any productive labor. Oliver immediately straightened his posture. His face masked itself in a practiced mask of aristocratic indifference. Jane, however, did not scramble to her feet in a flurry of subservient curtsies. She rose slowly, with a dignity that suggested she was conceding the space rather than surrendering her authority. Her eyes met his. For a moment, the social distance between a duke and a governess seemed to vanish. It was replaced by the silent communication of two people who understood the weight of responsibility. Arthur looked at the desk. He noted the precision of the lesson plan and the meticulous way the schoolroom accounts were kept in a small, ink-stained ledger at Jane's elbow. He knew that his sister, Lady Beatrice Thorne, viewed the governess as a drab, useful creature of no more consequence than a sturdy chair. Beatrice saw a servant. Arthur saw something else. He saw a mind that functioned like a clockwork mechanism. It was untouched by the hysteria or the vanity that defined the women of his social circle. He saw a woman who expected no rescue because she had already calculated how to do without it. The schoolroom was thick with the scent of old paper and the fading light of a northern afternoon. Arthur realized then that the woman standing before him was not a victim of her circumstances. She was a commander of them. She did not seek his approval. She merely presented the facts of her labor. It was a matter of action, not of emotion. He noted the way she kept her hands folded in front of her. She was concealing the ink stains as if they were a secret she was not yet ready to share. He did not know then that those stains were the mark of a woman who was quietly buying back the very county he was losing. He did not know that she was the anonymous creditor whose name appeared on the most terrifying documents in his study. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the schoolroom floor, the Duke felt a sudden, sharp clarity. His estate was a ruin. His wards were a burden. His life was a sequence of failing audits. But here, in this small, cold room, there was order. There was a woman who understood that true power lay not in the title one inherited, but in the stewardship of the things one possessed. The ink-stained ledger on the table was not a literal thing. It was a kingdom of Jane's making, a territory where she was the undisputed sovereign. It was a weapon forged in the fires of her family's disgrace, and she wielded it with the precision that was both terrifying and beautiful. Arthur spoke then, his voice rasping slightly from disuse and the cold of the hall. He asked Jane if she found the work sufficient. The question was as much about her soul as it was about her employment. Jane looked at him. Her expression was as unreadable as the ancient texts they had been studying. She did not complain about the drafty rooms or the meager wages. She did not mention the loneliness of her position or the disdain of the other servants. She simply stated that the work was necessary. She added that in necessity there was a form of peace. It was her secret methodology of endurance, expressed in a single sentence. Arthur felt a humbling shift in his perception. He had spent years looking for a savior in the high courts of London. He had searched the boardrooms of moneylenders. He had never once glanced down at the woman who had been quietly auditing his world from the corner of his eye. He saw the strength in her straight spine. He saw the intellectual depth in her steady gaze. Where he had previously only seen an employee, he now saw a potential partner. The Duke did not know the truth of Jane's wealth, but in that moment, he realized he had been married to his failures while this woman's was building a future out of the very dust he had ignored. Jane turned back to the desk. Her fingers brushed the edge of the ink-stained ledger. The gesture was small and almost imperceptible. It was the finality of a closing door. She had counted the Duke's weaknesses, just as she had counted the boy's errors. She had filed them away with the same clinical precision. She was not a poor governess waiting to be saved. She was a woman who was waiting for the right moment to reveal that the ledger of their lives was finally beginning to balance. She imagined the meeting with Silas Penhaligon, her lawyer, and the documents that were currently making their way through the Northern Post. The silence of the room returned. It was a heavy, expectant presence. As Arthur walked away, he felt for the first time in years that the ticking of the clock was not a countdown to ruin. It was the steady pulse of a restoration he was only just beginning to understand. Jane remained at her post, her pen hovering over a new entry. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply recorded the day's progress, her hand steady and her mind clear. The debt was being repaid, one small, meticulous entry at a time. The world thought she was a servant. But as she dipped her pen into the violet-black ink, she knew the truth. She was the architect of their salvation, and the blueprints were written in the very stains they looked down upon. The library of Ravenscroft Hall was a cavern of lost ambitions, smelling of damp vellum, dying embers, and the bitter, metallic scent of cold ink. It was a room where the history of a dynasty was recorded in leather-bound volumes, yet the air held the unmistakable of a chouse that could no longer afford to warming its own heart. Arthur Ravenscroft sat behind a massive mahogany desk that had served 10 generations of dukes, but tonight, the wood felt less like a seat of power and more like a raft in a rising tide of insolvency. He did not look like a man of leisure. His cravat was loosened. His winter-grey eyes were underscored by the bruised shadows of exhaustion, and his fingers were stained with the frantic scribbles of a man trying to outrun a ledger that refused to balance. Before him lay a sea of documents, notices of arrears, letters from solicitors, and the increasingly frequent demands from an anonymous creditor who seemed to be systematically purchasing the mortgages of the surrounding county. Jane Sterling entered the room without a sound, her movement as fluid and purposeful as a shadow across a sundial. She did not wait to be summoned into the light of the single, sputtering candle that fought against the gloom. She stood at the edge of the desk, her spine a perfectly vertical line of grey bombazine, her hands folded over the small, ink-stained ledger she always carried. She measured the room in a single, clinical glance. She saw the missing teeth in the library shelves, where the most valuable first editions had been sold to pay the winter's coal bill. She saw the frayed edge of the Duke's sleeve and the way the silver inkwell had gone unpolished for weeks. To another woman, this would have been a scene of tragic decline. To Jane, it was an audit. She did not see a ruined aristocrat. She saw a set of variables that required a definitive solution. Arthur did not look up immediately. He continued to stare at a particularly aggressive letter from a London law firm, his jaw set in a line of weary defiance. He spoke without raising his head, his voice rasping against the heavy silence of the room. He remarked that the children had been quiet this evening, a feat he attributed entirely to her influence. He said it was as if she had brought an invisible architecture of order into a house that was structurally determined to collapse. Jane did not offer a humble smile. She required no warmth from his praise. She simply stated that children, like estates, responded to the certainty of logic rather than the volatility of emotion. She added that the schoolroom was currently the only room in Ravenscroft Hall where the accounts were in perfect order. It was a statement of fact, not a boast, delivered with the rhythmic precision of a ticking clock. The Duke finally looked up, his icy gaze meeting her steady, unblinking eyes. He saw the faint stain of violet-black ink on her fingertips, the mark of her private labor, the sign of a woman who spent her nights counting what others had discarded. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of necessity. He was a man drowning in a sea of unmanaged debts, and here was the only person in his life who seemed to understand the grammar of survival. He did not offer a romantic preamble. He did not speak of the heart or the stirrings of a gentleman's affection. Instead, he spoke of stewardship. He spoke of the vacuum left by the death of his late wife and the increasing cruelty of his sister, Lady Beatrice Thorne. He said that he needed a partner who was not afraid of the cold, someone whose mind was as disciplined as her hands. He stood then, the floorboards groaning under the weight of his responsibility. He walked to the window, looking out over the dark, neglected fields that were being swallowed by the mortgages of J. Sterling. He spoke into the glass, asking Jane if she would consider a change in her position. He did not ask her to be his lover. He asked her to be his duchess. He framed the proposal as a matter of administrative urgency. He needed a mother for his wards, a mistress for a failing house, and a mind he could trust when the solicitors finally breached the doors. The proposal was not a romantic gesture. It was a contract of survival. It was a desperate bid to secure the one asset he had left, the order she had established in the schoolroom. The quiet governess offered no gasp. She did not flutter her eyelashes or reach for a handkerchief to mop up tears of joy. She stood perfectly still, her mind performing a rapid internal calculus of the situation. She weighed the social risk against the tactical advantage. To marry the Duke was to move from the shadows of the schoolroom to the target of the ballroom, but it also provided the legal standing she needed to finalize her acquisition of the county. She did not think of the title. She did not think of the prestige. She thought of the ledger. She saw the Duke's vulnerability not as a flaw, but as a space where her own sovereignty could take root. She waited for exactly 10 seconds, measured by the rhythmic pulse in her own throat, before she gave her answer. She did not say that she was honored. She did not say that she would strive to be worthy of his name. She simply looked him in the eye and stated that a marriage of convenience was the most honest form of partnership available to people in their position. She added that she would expect full access to the estate accounts and the authority to manage the household without interference. It was a counteroffer, a professional negotiation conducted in the dead of night. Arthur felt a strange, humbling relief wash over him. He had expected a woman to be frightened by the ruins of his life. Instead, he had found the only person capable of rebuilding them. He nodded once, a gesture of solemn agreement. The marriage was not a union of souls. It was a merger of necessities, finalized in a room that smelled of dust and lost hope. The next morning, the news of the impending nuptials moved through the drafty corridors of Ravenscroft Hall like a cold draught. It was met with a silence that was more judgmental than any outcry. In the long, stone-floored hallway that connected the kitchen to the grand foyer, Jane Sterling encountered Lady Beatrice Thorne. The Duke's sister was a woman, composed of sharp angles and inherited arrogance, her silks hissing against the stone as she moved. She stood in the center of the hall, blocking Jane's path, her eyes narrowed with a venom that no amount of aristocratic breeding could conceal. Beatrice looked at Jane's grey bombazine, at her ink-stained fingers, and at the quiet, unshakable dignity of her posture, and she saw an interloper. Beatrice did not lower her voice. She spoke with a volume intended to be heard by the servants lurking in the shadows. She called Jane a grey moth who had found a way to crawl into the Duke's bed because she was too plain to find a husband of her own station. She mocked the idea of a governess wearing the Ravenscroft diamonds, claiming that the gems would look like pebbles against such a drab, common throat. She spoke of the lack of a dowry, of the scandal of a duke marrying a woman with no family and no fortune, a woman who brought nothing to the house but the smell of old paper and the stain of a teacher's ink. To Beatrice, Jane was a pity bride, a desperate measure taken by a brother who had lost his senses along with his wealth. Jane Sterling did not flinch. She did not lower her gaze or offer a stammering defense of her character. She stood with her spine as rigid as a surveyor's rod, her eyes fixed on a small, fraying thread on the shoulder of Beatrice's expensive lace shawl. She viewed no superior social figure. She perceived a debtor who was too arrogant to realize she was already bankrupt. Jane counted the seconds of Beatrice's tirade, treating the insults like errors in a translation. They were noise, distractions from the primary logic of the situation. She waited until the older woman had exhausted her vocabulary of scorn, until the silence of the hallway was thick with Beatrice's labored breathing. Jane did not scream. She did not weep. She did not respond to the personal attacks with the heat they were intended to provoke. Instead, she stepped forward, forcing Beatrice to yield a single inch of the stone floor. She addressed her in tones that were low, level, and utterly lacking in emotion. It was a voice that belonged in a boardroom, not a hallway. She remarked that the lack of a dowry was a matter for the Duke and his solicitors to discuss, but that a lack of manners was a matter for the mistress of the house to address. She added that as the future Duchess of Ravenscroft, she would find it necessary to audit the household expenses, beginning with the exorbitant costs of Lady Beatrice's personal dressmakers. The silence that followed was absolute. Beatrice's face went from the pale white of fury to a blotchy, panicked red. She had expected the governess to be crushed by the weight of her social inferiority. She had not expected to be audited. Jane's words were not a literal threat. They were a kingdom of authority she was claiming before the ink on the marriage license was even dry. She did not wait for a rebuttal. She did not grant Beatrice the satisfaction of a continued argument. She performed a curtsy that was a silent, lethal weapon of social defiance, perfectly executed, impeccably timed, and completely stripped of subservience. It was a personal tactic for self-preservation, a calculated withdrawal that left the enemy stunned and speechless in the cold hallway. Jane walked away, the sound of her own steady footsteps echoing against the stone. She did not feel the sting of the insults. She did not feel the cold of the drafty house. She felt only the weight of the ink-stained ledger in her hand, and the knowledge that the documents currently moving through the post would soon render Beatrice's arrogance irrelevant. She was not a poor governess, marrying for safety. She was a sovereign who had just offered a treaty to a failing nation. As she climbed the stairs back to the schoolroom, she did not look back. She looked toward the ticking of the clock, counting the hours until the marriage would be finalized, and the ledger of Ravenscroft Hall would finally pass into her capable, ink-stained hands. The world thought she was being saved, but Jane Sterling knew the truth. She was the architect, and the ruin was merely the foundation of her new empire. The morning of the wedding was as grey as the eyes of the man Jane Sterling was about to marry, a leaden sky pressing down upon the jagged stone peaks of the northern horizon. The carriage ride to the parish church had been conducted in absolute silence, the only sound the rhythmic strike of the horses' hooves against the frozen mud. The air inside the church was a physical weight, thick, with the scent of damp stone, ancient dust, and the sharp, acidic smell of old hymnals that had not been opened in seasons. It was a ceremony stripped of the gilded excess that usually accompanied the union of a duke. There were no banks of hothouse lilies to mask the smell of rot in the floorboards. There were no cascading ribbons of white silk to hide the peeling plaster of the sanctuary walls. Instead, there was a handful of the local gentry who had come out of a morbid, predatory curiosity to see the schoolroom duchess take her place in a lineage they believed she had no right to touch. Jane stood at the altar, her spine a perfectly vertical line that refused to yield to the chill of the unheated chapel. She wore a dress of dove-grey silk, a garment Arthur Ravenscroft had provided, which she knew, by the simple calculus of her own observations, represented a significant portion of his remaining liquid capital. Jane did not look at the pews, but she felt the heat of their collective disdain pressing against the back of her neck. She measured the room in the rhythmic pulse of her own blood, treating the whispers behind her like the idle chatter of a schoolroom that had yet to be mastered. She heard the soft, biting remark from a woman in the third row concerning the lack of a bridal veil. The suggestion was that a governess had no innocence left to shroud, or perhaps the Ravenscrofts could no longer afford the lace. She did not flinch. She did not allow her hands to tremble as they held a small, leather-bound prayer book. She counted the cracks in the flagstone beneath her feet, 12 in total from the altar to the first pew, a mental exercise that kept her mind anchored in logic, while the social atmosphere attempted to drown her in shame. To her, the wedding was not a romantic culmination of a courtship. It was a legal alignment, a necessary step in a long-term audit of her own life and the county she had been quietly colonizing. The mocking smiles of the congregation were irrelevant to the mathematics of her future. Arthur Ravenscroft stood beside her, his winter-grey eyes fixed forward with a grim, stoic intensity. He did not look like a man in the throes of passion, nor did he offer the false comforts of a traditional groom. He looked like a general surrendering his last fortress to a commoner because he had run out of bread and gunpowder. His posture was rigidly correct, an aristocratic shield against the humiliating reality of his financial decay. When the time came for the exchange of vows, his voice was a low, resonant rasp that seemed to vibrate against the cold stone of the church. He spoke the words with a weary, almost mournful dignity, pronouncing the binding syllables as though sealing a treaty rather than a marriage. When he slid the ring onto Jane's finger, a heavy, antique band of gold that had not been polished in a generation, It felt like the closing of a circuit. The ring was not a token of affection. It was a contract of reclamation. It was the key that granted her the legal standing to step into the wreckage of his house and begin the work of reconstruction. As she looked down at the dull gold against her ink-stained skin, she felt the shift in the ledger. The world thought she was being elevated to a position of grace, but Jane Sterling knew she was merely taking possession of an asset she had already paid for in silence. The wedding breakfast that followed at Ravenscroft Hall was an exercise in suppressed hostility and domestic failure. The long table in the dining hall was set with the remaining Ravenscroft silver, though the polish was thin and the metal beneath was dull with the tarnish of neglect. The meal was meager, a selection of cold meats, bread that lacked the fineness of the London bakeries, and a wine that was passable but lacked the depth of a truly prosperous cellar. Lady Beatrice Thorne sat at the far end of the table, her face a mask of pale aristocratic fury. She did not eat. She sat with her hands folded over her silk skirts, her eyes darting toward Jane with a venom that was entirely uncurbed by the presence of the guests. Beatrice spoke to the woman beside her in a voice intended to be overheard, remarking that it was a tragedy when a house of 10 generations was forced to marry its own furniture to keep the roof from falling in. Master Oliver Ravenscroft sat silently near his aunt, his gaze shifting between his plate and the new Duchess, watching the tense dynamics with a wary defensive caution. The newly titled Duchess ignored the bait. She sat at the head of the table as the new Duchess of Ravenscroft, her posture as rigid as a surveyor's rod. She watched the servants move through the room, noting the frayed edges of their liveries and the way they avoided her gaze, terrified of a new mistress, who might finally notice their systemic pilfering. She saw the missing teeth in the silver service, the heavy candelabras that were gone, the ornate salt cellars that were absent, and she mentally added them to the list of things that had been pawned to maintain the illusion of status. To the guests, she was a drab, lucky creature who had stumbled into a title. To Jane, the guests were variables in a failing equation. She saw a neighboring baron seated beside Beatrice, adjusting his silk cravat with an air of superiority. From her secret correspondence with Silas Penhaligon, she knew the baron's estate was currently 3 months in arrears on a mortgage held by an anonymous creditor. She saw the local magistrate's nervous habit of checking his watch, and knew he was waiting for a letter of foreclosure that was currently sitting in her own desk at the schoolroom. They dined on her husband's crumbling pride, unaware that the quiet woman carving the cold meat owned the very ground beneath their estates. 2 weeks passed in a heavy, watchful silence. The marriage had not changed Jane's habits. It had only expanded her territory. During those first 14 days, she did not play the part of a blushing bride. She did not pursue Arthur's company in the drafty drawing rooms, nor did she wait for the servants to bring her breakfast in bed. Instead, she moved through the house with a quiet, methodical intensity. She conducted a silent audit of the linen closets, finding the sheets thin enough to see through, and the tablecloths mended with such desperation they were more thread than fabric. She demanded the keys from a resentful housekeeper, taking inventory of the barren pantries and the empty wine cellars. She audited the scullery, where the copper pots were black with soot, and instituted a rigorous system of rationing for the coal. She calculated the cost of grain for the few remaining horses and reorganized the shifts of the stable hands, eliminating the idle hours that had drained the estate's resources. The servants muttered in the kitchens, resentful of the strict new regime, but they could not argue with the results. The fireplaces drew properly for the first time. In years, the meals were served with precise punctuality, and the pervasive dust of neglect began to recede under the relentless sweep of her authority. She also observed Master Oliver Ravenscroft. The boy had initially met her new status with a sullen, defensive silence, bracing himself for the tyranny of a stepmother. Jane did not try to win his affection with false sweetness or sudden indulgences. She simply maintained the same rigorous schedule for his lessons, treating the schoolroom as a sanctuary of order in a house of chaos. The predictability of her discipline became a quiet anchor for the child, his hostility slowly eroding under the steady rhythm of her expectations. Meanwhile, she noticed that Arthur avoided her. He was a ghost in his own house, his footsteps echoing in the library late at night. He looked at her over the dinner table with a mixture of guilt and a strange, burgeoning respect for the way she managed the household's meager resources without complaint. He watched her ink-stained fingers moving over her private ledgers, unaware of the vast wealth they commanded. By the end of the second week, the atmosphere inside Ravenscroft Hall had shifted from social performance to a stark, cold reality. The frost was thick on the windows when Arthur finally sent word that he required her presence in his study. The study was a cavern of lost ambitions, the walls lined with books that smelled of damp vellum and the bitter, metallic scent of cold ink. A single candle burned on the massive mahogany desk, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floorboards. Arthur Ravenscroft did not sit. He walked to the window, his back to her, looking out over the dark fields that were being swallowed by the mortgages held by the mysterious J. Sterling. He spoke into the glass, his voice a low, heavy vibration that carried the weight of his entire lineage. He told her that he had led her into a house of mirrors. He confessed that the title he had given her was a gilded cage, and the bars were made of debt. He admitted that the estate was not merely struggling, it was on the brink of total, catastrophic ruin. The insolvency had moved from the margins of his ledgers to the very center of his life. He was at the mercy of an anonymous, ruthless landlord who had been systematically purchasing his debts for a decade, an invisible entity who had entirely cornered the Ravenscroft holdings. Jane stood in the center of the room, her grey silk skirts whispering against the floorboards. She offered no gasp at the revelation. She did not weep for the loss of the fortune she was supposed to have married, nor did she hurl accusations of deceit. She stood perfectly still, her mind performing a rapid internal audit of the information he was providing. She saw the Duke's vulnerability not as a betrayal, but as a confirmation of her own calculations. He told her that he had married her because he needed a mind that could withstand the cold, someone who would not crumble when the bailiffs finally breached the doors. He spoke of the J. Sterling, who held his life in a paper grip, a creditor who had shown no face and no mercy. He admitted that by marrying him, she had become a partner in his failure, a casualty in a war he had already lost. Arthur turned to look at her then, his winter-grey eyes filled with a mixture of shame and a desperate, searching hope. He asked her if she understood the gravity of their position. He asked her if she was frightened of the ruin that awaited them. Jane did not answer immediately. She walked to the desk, her movements measured by the ticking of the long case clock in the corner. She reached out and touched the leather-bound folder that contained his most terrifying debts. The folder was not a literal thing. It was a kingdom of numbers that she had already conquered in the dark of the schoolroom nights. She traced the line of a particularly crippling loan taken out against the northern pastures, noting the exact date of its maturity. She recognized the figures, the precise interest rates, the merciless compounding arithmetic she had personally devised. She looked at the signature on the letters of demand, the precise, ink-stained script of J. Sterling, and she felt a sudden, sharp sense of ordered peace. The man before her was bracing for a collapse, but she was calculating a foundation. She did not tell him the truth yet. She did not reveal that she was the anonymous creditor who held the keys to his house. Instead, she looked him in the eye and addressed him with a steady cadence, completely free of heat. She remarked that a house in ruin was merely a house that had not yet been properly managed. She told him that she had not married a duke to be a decorative object. She had married a partner to be an architect. She asked to see the books, not out of curiosity, but as a matter of stewardship. She requested full access to the estate accounts, the farm leases, and the household payroll. Arthur watched her, a strange, humbling realization dawning in his eyes. He had expected a poor governess who would need his protection. He had found instead a sovereign who was already preparing for a campaign of restoration. The night air outside the study window was cold and silent, the frost beginning to lace the glass with delicate, crystalline patterns. Inside, the candle flickered, casting a warm, orange light over the ink-stained fingers of the woman who was now the Duchess of Ravenscroft. Jane experienced no crushing weight from the Duke's debt. She felt only the weight of the opportunity. She was not a victim of his insolvency, she was the solution to it. As she opened the first ledger, the sound of the parchment turning was a sharp, decisive crack in the silence of the room. She asked for no comfort from him, She craved no romantic vows, she simply began to count, her mind clear and her hands steady, the first entry of their new life already taking shape in her quiet, solitary discipline of endurance. The ledger of Ravenscroft Hall was finally in her hands, and the balance was about to change. The mahogany desk of the Duke's study was a battlefield of paper, a landscape where the Ravenscroft heritage lay bleeding in columns of red ink and desperate, illegible scribbles. The single candle, burned down to a jagged stump of tallow, cast a wavering, amber light over the documents that Arthur Ravenscroft had surrendered to his new wife. Jane Sterling sat in the high-backed chair, her spine an uncompromising vertical against the velvet upholstery, her fingers moving with the rhythmic, surgical precision of an auditor. She did not look like a woman who had just been told her life was a ruin. She never sought the shadow's comfort or the relief of a soft bed. Instead, she immersed herself in the cold, hard grammar of insolvency, her mind performing a rapid internal calculus that translated every debt, every mortgage, and every failed harvest into a singular, manageable truth. To Arthur, who stood by the fireplace watching the flickering embers, the ledgers were a record of his shame. In Jane's estimation, the ledgers were not a literal book. They were a kingdom of variables waiting to be ordered. Jane did not speak for 3 hours. The only sound in the room was the ticking of the long case clock and the crisp, decisive turn of the vellum pages. She measured the estate's decay by the scratching of her pen. She noted the discrepancy in the grain tithes from the previous autumn. A leak of capital that suggested a steward, who was either incompetent or dishonest. She traced the interest rates on the northern mortgages, recognizing the predatory compounding she had personally calculated while sitting in the schoolroom months prior. She did not feel a pang of guilt for the strategic web she had woven. She felt only the satisfaction of a craftsman seeing the final pieces of a long-term project snap into place. She observed the way the Duke's hand trembled as he reached for the poker, a physical manifestation of a man who had lost his grip on his inheritance. Jane, however, did not tremble. She counted. Arthur finally spoke, his voice a low, raspy vibration that seemed to struggle against the heavy silence of the room. He asked her if the situation was as dire as he had feared. He admitted that he had tried to shield Master Oliver Ravenscroft from the reality, but the walls were closing in. He looked at her. His winter-grey eyes filled with a weary, searching respect. He said that he had hired the most expensive accountants from the capital, and even they had been baffled by the complexity of the J. Sterling acquisitions. Jane did not reveal that she was the architect of that complexity. She did not admit that the city accountants had failed because they were looking for a merchant prince, never suspecting a governess with ink-stained fingers. Instead, she delivered her assessment evenly and analytically, lacking any warmth. She added that in a house of 10 generations, one often forgot that land was a contract of stewardship, not a birthright of luxury. She did not offer him a false hope. She did not claim that the estate could be saved by a simple reduction in household expenses or a better yield on the barley. She stood up, her grey silk skirts whispering against the floorboards, and walked to the desk, where she had organized the papers into 3 distinct piles. She pointed to the largest pile, the debts held by the anonymous creditor. She spoke in a voice that was level, analytical, and entirely devoid of heat. She informed him that his primary creditor was not a ruthless enemy, but a meticulous auditor. She noted that the acquisitions were strategic, designed to consolidate the county rather than dismantle the duchy. Arthur watched her, a strange, humbling realization dawning in his gaze. He saw that while he had been drowning in the tide, his wife was already mapping the currents. Jane did not allow the intimacy of the late hour to soften her professional resolve. She measured the distance between them, both social and intellectual, and found the balance correct. She told him that she would require his signature on a power of attorney for the upcoming meeting with the creditor's solicitor. She explained that a duchess would be less likely to be dismissed by the legal men than a duke whose reputation was already tarnished by arrears. Arthur hesitated, his pride a flickering flame against the cold reality of her competence. He looked at the woman he had married for convenience and saw a sovereign in her own right. He pressed for no explanations. He took the pen and signed the document, his hand steady for the first time in months. The act was a surrender of authority, a recognition that her solitary methods of enduring had become the public art of management. As the first light of dawn began to grey the windows, Jane finally closed the last ledger. The sound was a sharp, final crack that signaled the end of the audit. She did not celebrate. She expected no words of gratitude. She simply blew out the candle, leaving the room in the pale, cold clarity of the morning. She told the Duke that the meeting with Silas Penhaligon would take place at noon. She added that he should prepare to be a spectator in his own library. She did not wait for his response. She walked to the door, her spine as straight as a surveyor's rod, her mind already moving toward the arrival of the carriage. She was not a poor governess who had been given a title. She was an empire that had just been given a name. The morning air at Ravenscroft Hall was a biting, medicinal cold that tasted of frost and damp stone. In the breakfast room, the atmosphere was a thick, stagnant weight of expectation. Lady Beatrice Thorne sat at the head of the table, her silk shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the door with a predatory hunger. She did not acknowledge Jane's entrance. She spoke to the empty air, remarking that it was a pity the house had to be subjected to the indignity of a solicitor's visit so soon after a wedding. She suggested that perhaps the grey moth had expected a life of ease and was now finding the reality of a bankrupt husband to be a bitter pill. Beatrice failed to recognize the Duchess. She merely observed a servant who had overreached her station and was about to be crushed by the weight of the family's ruin. The young woman let the barb pass unanswered. She took her seat and began to peel an orange, her movements as fluid and purposeful as a clockwork mechanism. She avoided glancing at Beatrice, but she measured the woman's insecurity by the volume of her voice and the sharpness of her jewelry. She saw the way Beatrice's fingers toyed with a heavy gold locket, a piece that Jane knew. From her secret audits was one of the few remaining family heirlooms not yet pledged to a pawnbroker. For Jane, the locket was not a jewel. It was a variable in the household budget. She had no immediate desire to humiliate the woman. She merely counted the seconds until the arrival of the Northern Post, treating the social friction like the static before a thunderstorm. Arthur Ravenscroft entered the room, his face a mask of aristocratic indifference that failed to hide the bruised shadows beneath his eyes. He sat beside Jane, his presence a silent shield against his sister's vitriol. He did not speak of the ledgers or the power of attorney. He simply observed his wife. He saw the way she handled the small, silver fruit knife, the precision of her grip, and the steady, unblinking focus of her gaze. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of recognition. He realized that the woman beside him was the only person in the room who truly knew the temperature of the house. He watched as she set the orange peel aside in a perfect, unbroken spiral, a small, symbolic restoration of order in a room defined by decay. The sound of carriage wheels against the gravel of the driveway broke the tension like a gunshot. Beatrice stood up, her face lighting with a cruel, expectant joy. She remarked that the end had finally arrived, and she hoped the governess had kept her old references, as she would likely need them by nightfall. Jane did not rise. She did not allow the silver fruit knife to slip. She waited for exactly 10 seconds, measured by the rhythmic pulse in her own throat, before she looked toward the doorway. She perceived no threat. She recognized a legal instrument. Silas Penhaligon entered the room with the quiet, authoritative grace of a man who had spent his life in the presence of power and the shadows of the law. He was dressed in a black coat of impeccable cut, his silver-topped cane a gleaming weapon of social standing. He did not look like a harbinger of ruin. He looked like a master of ceremonies. He scanned the room with a clinical, detached interest, his eyes lingering for a fraction of a second on Jane Sterling. The recognition was instantaneous, a silent communication between two people who understood the weight of the documents he carried. In his heavy leather briefcase, Silas did not offer a subservient bow to the Duke or a flattering smile to Lady Beatrice. He moved with a purpose that was entirely independent of their titles. Arthur stood to greet him, his posture rigidly correct, his pale eyes narrowed with a desperate, defensive courage. His tone was level but strained as he welcomed the solicitor to Ravenscroft Hall and suggesting they move to the library for the final accounting. He looked at Jane, a silent invitation for her to join them, an act that caused Beatrice Thorne to let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. The Duke's sister remarked that the library was no place for a nursery maid, even one who wore an antique wedding ring she couldn't afford. She suggested that Jane remain in the breakfast room and prepare the tea, as that was the only labor she was truly fit for. Jane Sterling rose from her chair, her spine a perfectly vertical line of grey silk. She kept her eyes off Beatrice. She did not defend her right to be present. She simply stepped toward Silas Penhaligon, her movement as decisive as a move on a chessboard. She made no move to claim the briefcase. She simply noted its presence as a matter of fact. She replied with a low, resonant clarity, utterly free of tension. She remarked that the library was indeed the place for an accounting, as it was the only room in the house large enough to hold the weight of the truth. She added that Lady Beatrice was welcome to attend, provided she understood that the meeting was a matter of stewardship, not of social display. Silas Penhaligon stepped back, allowing Jane to lead the way toward the library. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible to an untrained eye, but to Arthur, it was a revelation. He saw the solicitor yield the floor to his wife, not out of politeness, but out of a profound professional deference. He saw that the man of the law was not there to speak to the Duke. He was there to report to the Duchess. The hierarchy of the house had shifted in a single, silent movement. As they walked down the drafty corridor, the sound of their footsteps echoing against the stone, Jane did not look back. She refrained from checking the expression on Beatrice's face or the shock in Arthur's eyes. She looked toward the library doors, counting the steps until the final audit would begin. The world thought the bailiffs had arrived to take the house, but Jane Sterling knew the truth. The sovereign had arrived to claim her kingdom, and the ledger was finally ready to be balanced. The library was thick with the scent of old paper and the fading light of a cold morning. The massive mahogany desk had been cleared of its previous clutter, leaving only a single, ink-stained blotter in the center. Silas Penhaligon took his seat, his movements methodical and rhythmic, as he began to lay out the documents. He did not speak immediately. He measured the room, his eyes moving from the Duke's weary face to the Duchess's unshakable composure. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a heavy wax-sealed folder, the deed of assignment. It was not a literal piece of paper. It was a contract of reclamation, a weapon forged in the silence of a decade of labor. Jane sat across from him, her hands folded over her own ink-stained ledger, her fingers smelling of ink and old paper. She did not flinch. She did not blink. She simply began the count. Silas Penhaligon's fingers moved across the surface of the mahogany desk, with the practiced, rhythmic grace of a man who dealt in the absolute finality of the law. He did not reach back into his leather briefcase, for the primary folder already lay before him, a silent monument to a decade of labor. Instead, he began to arrange the supporting vellum documents, the mortgages, the mining leases, and the forestal rights, creating a grid of ownership that spanned the entire county. The sound of the vellum sliding against the wood was the only noise in the vaulted library, a dry, whispering record of the family's decline. Silas measured the tension in the room by the shallow, ragged breathing of Lady Beatrice Thorne and the heavy, stunned stillness of Arthur Ravenscroft. The ink on the pages was dark and uncompromising, bearing the signatures of various lords and gentry scrawled in the desperate, shaky hands of men who had run out of time. At the center of this legal architecture, the master deed of assignment sat under Silas's hand, its wax seal appearing like a fresh wound upon the desk. Lady Beatrice stepped forward, her silk skirts hissing like a cornered viper against the floorboards. Her face was a mask of incredulous scorn, her eyes darting from the solicitor to the quiet woman in grey bombazine. She ignored the papers. Her focus shifted to the perceived impossibility of the situation. Her tone emerged high and brittle, demanding to know why a man of Silas's standing was engaging in this theatrical farce. She remarked that the grey moth sitting across from them was a servant who had likely stolen a set of keys, not a woman who could possibly understand the complexities of land tenure. To Lady Beatrice, the scene was a social insult, a breach of the natural order that required immediate and loud correction. She reached out a trembling hand as if to sweep the documents from the desk, to erase the reality they represented. The ink-stained sovereign held her ground without a flinch. She did not rise to defend her honor or offer a stammering explanation to the woman who had spent years treating her as a fixture of the schoolroom. She sat with her spine a perfectly vertical line of grey silk, her hands folded over her own ink-stained ledger. She watched the hand of Lady Beatrice approach the desk and, with a movement so small it was almost imperceptible, she shifted her gaze to Silas. The solicitor immediately moved his silver-topped cane, placing it firmly atop the deed of assignment. It was a silent, professional rebuff that carried the weight of the entire legal establishment. Silas refused to glance at Lady Beatrice. He focused on the Duke. Arthur Ravenscroft leaned forward. His winter-grey eyes narrowed as he traced the name, written at the bottom of the topmost document. He failed to spot the title of a merchant prince or the seal of a capital bank. He saw the precise, ink-stained script he had seen every day for 3 years on his ward's Latin lessons. The name was J. Sterling, and the signature was an exact match for the one in the schoolroom ledger. He felt a sudden, jarring sensation of the world tilting on its axis. He looked at Jane Sterling, the woman he had married because he thought she was as penniless and desperate as his own estate, and he saw the ghost of every demand, every foreclosure, and every predatory mortgage that had haunted his dreams. He realized then that the ruthless creditor who had systematically cornered his duchy was not a faceless entity in the city. It was the woman who had been quietly teaching Master Oliver Ravenscroft the logic of the stars. The Duke spoke then, his voice a low, hollow rasp that seemed to struggle with the sheer magnitude of the truth. He asked Silas if he was truly suggesting that the mortgages for the northern pastures, the leases for the mining rights, and the very ground of Ravenscroft Hall were held by the woman sitting beside him. Silas Penhaligon did not offer a dramatic flair. He simply turned the deed of assignment around so that the primary signature was facing the Duke. He remarked that Jane Sterling did not merely hold the mortgages. She was the sole proprietor of the debt and the ultimate owner of the assignments. He added that the documents currently on the desk proved that she held the legal and financial sovereignty over more than half the county. It was a matter of stewardship, not of pride, and the balance of the ledger was absolute. The silence that followed was a physical weight, thick with the scent of old paper and the realization of a total power reversal. Arthur Ravenscroft looked at the ink-stained fingers of his wife. He saw the violet-black marks not as a sign of service, but as the stains of a conqueror. He remembered the night he had proposed to her, thinking he was offering her a sanctuary from her own poverty. He felt a surge of humbling, cold clarity. He had been drowning in a sea of his own making, and the person holding the rope was the one he had overlooked. He saw the strength in Jane's posture and the intellectual depth in her steady, unblinking gaze. She was not a poor governess who had been saved by a duke. She was a sovereign who had chosen to step into a ruin. Lady Beatrice Thorne let out a sharp, choked sound that was half law and half sob. She gripped the back of a mahogany chair, her knuckles white, her face a blotchy, panicked red. She turned to Arthur, her voice a desperate shriek, claiming that the papers must be forgeries, that a governess could never amass such a fortune through honest labor. She spoke of the family name, of the scandal of a Ravenscroft being owned by a schoolteacher, and of the social ruin that would follow if this truth were ever made public. For Lady Beatrice, the wealth was a crime against her status, a violation of the hierarchy that defined her existence. She envisioned no restoration of the estate. She merely felt the humiliation of her own irrelevance. Jane Sterling rose from her chair then, her movement as fluid and purposeful as a clockwork mechanism. She did not shout. She made no attempt to humiliate Lady Beatrice through a heated argument. She stood with her spine as straight as a surveyor's rod and articulated her stance in a low, resonant cadence, utterly detached from emotion. She remarked that wealth, like grammar, followed rules that were indifferent to the feelings of the speaker. She told Beatrice Thorne that the counting had begun long before she ever set foot in Ravenscroft Hall. She added that, while the peerage was busy performing the theatre of their own superiority, she had been quietly auditing the reality of their decline. Jane walked to the window, looking out over the fields she now legally commanded. She began to recount the years of her quiet resilience. She spoke of the decades she had spent in the schoolrooms of the county, moving from one drafty manor to another, always the invisible observer. She described how she had lived on a fraction of her meager wages, a choice that was a matter of necessity before it became a matter of strategy. She explained that in every house she entered, she did not merely teach the children, she audited the world. She had watched the lords of those houses gamble away their futures on the turn of a card or the failure of a single crop. She had listened to the stewards complain of mismanagement while she sat in the corner with a book of Greek verbs, mentally calculating the interest rates on the debts they were accumulating. She told Arthur that she had seen the patterns of ruin long before they manifested in the ledgers. She had watched the local gentry sell off their first editions and their silver salt cellars, treating the symptoms of their decay while she was buying the causes. She had used the family scandal that had initially cast her out, a father's gambling ruin, as a shield. Because the world believed she was a penniless victim, they never looked at her. They never suspected that the girl cleaning the inkwells was the same person purchasing the distressed mortgages through the offices of Silas Penhaligon. She had operated in the silence of her own invisibility, turning every social slight and every cold room into a variable in her own private calculus. She described the specific acquisition of the Ravenscroft mortgages. She had not bought them out of a desire for revenge, but out of a technical recognition of the estate's inherent value. She had seen the Duke struggle from the doorway of the schoolroom and realized that he was a man who understood duty, but lacked the tools of management. She had systematically purchased the debts from the predatory city banks, consolidating them under her own name to prevent the duchy from being dismantled piece by piece. She had been the ruthless creditor, not to destroy him, but to preserve the territory until a proper architect could take command. She did not call it love. She called it stewardship. The Duke watched her, his expression shifting from a mask of shock to an even deeper, more profound sense of respect. He saw the logic of her actions, the cold brilliance of a mind that could withstand the isolation of the schoolroom to build an empire of paper and stone. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of humility. He had spent years looking for a savior in the high courts of the capital, never glancing at the woman who was auditing his world from the corner of her eye. He realized that the order she had brought to the schoolroom was not a temporary fixture. It was the foundation of the sovereign power she was now revealing. She craved neither his approval nor his gratitude. She simply presented the balanced ledger of her life. Jane turned back from the window, the cold light of the morning illuminating the ink stains on her fingers. She walked to the desk and picked up the silver fruit knife she had used earlier that morning. She held it with a precision that suggested it was a tool, not a weapon. The silver fruit knife was not a piece of cutlery. It was a tool of surgical reclamation. She spoke to the room, but her eyes were fixed on Arthur Ravenscroft. She remarked that a house in ruin was merely a house that had not yet been properly managed. She told him that she had not married him for his title, just as he had not married her for her mind. They had married for a shared necessity of order. She added that now that the truth was on the table, the partnership could finally begin in earnest. Silas Penhaligon stood up, his movements methodical and final. He gathered the documents back into his briefcase, leaving only the deed of assignment for the Duke to study. He bowed to Jane Sterling with a deference that was no longer professional, but personal, a recognition of the sovereign he had served in the shadows. He did not speak to Beatrice Thorne or offer a word of comfort to the Duke. He walked to the library door, his footsteps echoing with the rhythmic certainty of a clock, ticking toward a new era. As he closed the door, the sound was a sharp, decisive crack in the silence of the room. The library was left in a state of ordered silence. Arthur Ravenscroft looked at the deed of assignment, then at the woman who had transformed his ruin into a kingdom. He beheld no mere governess. He perceived no lowly servant. He saw a peer in intellect and a master in stewardship. He felt the weight of his own title finally beginning to set against the weight of her capability. He reached out and touched the antique wedding ring on her finger, the one he had thought was a mark of his pity. He realized it was the seal of his own salvation. Jane made no move to pull away. She did not blink. She simply waited for him to speak, her mind already moving toward the first entry of their new, balanced life. The ledger was open, and for the first time in 10 generations, the Ravenscroft name was backed by a mind that understood the true grammar of power. Arthur Ravenscroft remained in the vaulted library long after the sound of Silas Penhaligon's carriage had faded into the damp, heavy silence of the northern night. The room felt different now, as if the very air had been recalibrated by the revelations of the last hour. The massive mahogany desk was no longer a place of desperate calculations and looming foreclosure. It was the site of a profound surgical restoration. Arthur stood before the documents that still lay, spread across the blotter like the maps of a conquered territory. He paid no attention to the heavy wax seals or the ornate legal scripts that defined his lineage. His eyes were fixed on the signature of J. Sterling, the precise, ink-stained handwriting that he had seen every day on Ward's Latin lessons, now revealed as the mark of the woman who held the fate of his duchy in her steady hands. He felt a sudden, jarring sensation of the world, tilting on its axis. He had married a governess because he thought she possessed the mind to endure his ruin. He realized now that he had married the architect who had already secretly rebuilt it. Jane Sterling stood by the tall, narrow window, her silhouette a sharp, vertical line of grey silk against the deep violet of the encroaching dusk. She spared no glance for the Duke with the triumph of a creditor, or the pleading of a wife who feared her secret had been discovered too late. She looked out over the dark fields of the county with the same calm, analytical focus she applied to a difficult Greek translation. She measured the silence in the room by the rhythmic pulse in her own throat, waiting for the logic of the situation to settle in her husband's mind. She did not offer him a hollow comfort or a romantic apology. She understood that for a man of his station, the shock of her wealth was not nearly as potent as the shock of her competence. She had practiced her discreet mastery of enduring for a decade, and the transition to a public art of sovereignty was a matter of action, not of emotion. Arthur moved toward her, his footsteps heavy and deliberate on the floorboards that no longer groaned with the weight of debt. He did not speak of the heart or the dizzying complexity of the mortgages she had acquired. He stopped exactly 3 paces from her, observing the way the fading light caught the faint violet-black stain of ink on her fingers. He saw those marks now as the stains of a sovereign, the honorable scars of a woman who had fought for her placet in a world that had tried to render her invisible. He felt a surge of humbling clarity. He had spent years looking for a savior in the high courts of London and the boardrooms of the city, never once realizing that the salvation of the Ravenscroft name was being drafted in the quiet of the schoolroom. He looked at her straight spine and her unshakable composure, and he felt the last remnants of his aristocratic pride dissolve into a profound intellectual respect. The Duke sank to one knee, the fabric of his trousers rustling against the worn Persian carpet. It was a gesture that defied every social law of the Regency era. A duke bowing before a woman the world still considered his inferior in blood and fortune. But Arthur viewed her not as a governess. He considered her no servant. He saw a peer in every sense that mattered. He took her hand, the one that smelled of starch and old paper, and held it with a reverence he had never shown to a living soul. He did not ask for her gold to fix his house. He asked for her mind to lead it. He addressed her with a low, steady sincerity, stripped of the arrogance of his title. He told her that he had thought he was giving her a name to protect her from the cold, but he realized now that she was the one who had kept the fire burning when he had run out of wood. He begged no pardon for his previous blindness. He simply asked to be her partner in the stewardship of the world she had built. Jane did not pull away. She did not blink. She looked down at the man who was the highest authority in the county, now kneeling in the shadows of his own library. She counted the seconds of his silence, treating the moment like a finalized entry in a ledger. She saw the winter gray of his eyes filled with a new, expansive trust, a bond built not on the fleeting whims of passion, but on the solid foundation of mutual respect for capability. She did not tell him she loved him. She told him that the northern pastures would require a new drainage system by the spring. It was her way of accepting his surrender. She reached out with her other hand and touched his shoulder, a gesture of quiet, administrative intimacy. She told him to rise, for a house that was being restored had no need for its masters to be on the floor. She added that they had much work to do before the spring planting, and the ledger of their new life required its first entry. The morning came to Ravenscroft Hall with a sharp, medicinal clarity that tasted of frost and wood smoke. The air was no longer thick with the stagnant scent of neglect. It was fresh, moving through the open windows of the grand foyer, as the staff worked with a new, frantic purpose. Jane Sterling stood on the stone terrace overlooking the sprawling landscape of the county. The rolling hills, the dormant mining pits, and the tenant farms that spanned as far as the eye could see. She wore her grey bombazine, the dress she had worn every day for 3 years. But now the antique gold wedding ring on her finger gleamed with a new authoritative light. She looked out over the half of the county she legally commanded and felt the ordered peace of a task completed. Beside her stood Arthur, his posture no longer the rigid defense of a man in retreat, but the steady presence of a man who had finally found his ground. They were no longer the ruined duke and the poor governess. They were the sovereigns of a territory that had been reclaimed by intellect and stewardship. Arthur looked at the valley below, pointing out the specific cottages that had been falling into ruin under the previous anonymous landlord. Unaware that the landlord was now his duchess, he spoke of the repairs he had dreamed of making, the schools he had wanted to build for the tenants' children, and the ways the land could be made to thrive again if only there was the capital to back the vision. Jane listened with a clinical interest, her mind performing a rapid, internal audit of his plans. She did not interrupt him. She waited until he had finished his inventory of hope before she remarked that the capital was already allocated. She added that she had already reviewed the leases and found the terms to be in favor of the tenants, provided they agreed to the new crop rotation she had devised. Lady Beatrice Thorne appeared in the doorway of the terrace, her silk travel cloak wrapped tightly around her, her face a mask of pale, aristocratic defeat. She stood in the shadow of the stone archway, her eyes darting between the Duke and the woman she had spent years mocking as a grey moth. Beatrice did not speak. She had been audited by the reality of Jane's power and found entirely wanting. Her arrogance had been secrecy that was no longer accepted at Ravenscroft Hall. Jane did not turn to face her. She did not offer a final, biting insult or a gloating smile. She simply looked at the carriage waiting at the foot of the driveway. The carriage that would take Beatrice to a small, modest dower house in the south, far from the center of the empire she had tried to subvert. Jane remarked levelly to Arthur that the southern post was on time. She added that the housekeeping accounts would be much easier to manage without the burden of unnecessary lace and imported wines. Beatrice walked toward the stairs, the sound of her silk skirts hissing one last time against the stone. It was the sound of a fading era, a social order that was being replaced by the grammar of competence. Jane watched her go, counting the steps until the carriage door closed with a sharp, final crack. She did not feel the sting of the woman's past insults. She felt only the satisfaction of an architect who had removed a structural flaw from her design. The house was now a sanctuary of order, and the people within it were the variables she had chosen to keep. She turned back to Arthur, her spine a perfectly vertical line against the morning sun. She required no consolation from him. She sought his counsel on the new mining leases for the northern hills. The Duke reached out and took her hand, his fingers tracing the ink stains that would likely never fade. He did not see them as a mark of her former status. He saw them as the seal of their partnership. He told her that he had spent his life thinking that a duke's duty was to protect his house from the world. He realized now that his duty was to protect the woman who had already saved it. He spoke of the future not as a sequence of obligations, but as a journey of shared restoration. He asked her if she found the prospect of managing half the county to be sufficient for her mind. Jane Sterling looked at him, her expression as unreadable as the ancient texts they had once studied together. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply stated that in management there was a form of peace. The long case clock in the hall struck the hour, its rhythmic chime echoing through the stone corridors. It was a sound that Jane had always used to measure her private art of survival, but now it was the pulse of a house that was finally truly alive. She looked at the antique wedding ring on her finger. It was not a literal piece of jewelry. It was a contract of mutual sovereignty, a weapon of legal and social finality. She saw the landscape before her not as a view, but as a kingdom that required her constant, meticulous care. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer a shadow in the schoolroom. She was the mistress of the ledger, and the balance was finally correct. Arthur and Jane stood together on the balcony, overseeing a county that they now managed as equal sovereign partners. The air was cold, the stone was hard, and the work ahead of them was immense. But as they turned back toward the house, their footsteps moved with a steady, purposeful rhythm. The Duke did not lead her, and she did not follow him. They walked side by side, their movements synchronized by the logic of their shared necessity. The library was open, the ledger was ready, and for the first time in 10 generations, the Ravenscroft name was backed by a mind that understood the true grammar of power. The governess had become the Duchess, but the Duchess remained the architect, and in the ordered silence of the hall, the count had finally ended. The ledger was balanced, and for Jane Sterling, the world was finally perfectly seen.